Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios of the National Press Foundation in Washington, D.C. My name is Rachel Jones, and I am the Director of Journalism Initiatives with NPF. Thank you for joining us today for the Generative AI and the Law webinar. It's a free webinar sponsored by RELX, a global provider of analytic tools, including LexisNexis, which I'm sure many of you joining us today are familiar with. Though in its infancy, artificial intelligence is surging forward in leaps and bounds. Here to help the journalists and lawyers listening make sense of what's happening are some incredible experts. First, Marie C. Baca is an award-winning business and tech journalist who has appeared in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications. She currently serves as an advisor to Coastside News Group and New Mexico Legal News Fund. Jamie Buckley is the Chief Product Officer for LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and he joins us today from Silicon Valley. You may have seen him recently talking about AI with the Wall Street Journal. Next, Calum Chace joins us from Spain. He is also known as the AI Guy, the author of Surviving AI and the Economic Singularity, about the prospect of widespread technological unemployment. Prior to becoming a full-time speaker and writer, Calum had a long career as a journalist. Next, Jennifer Conrad reports for Inc. magazine and has written for Wired, Vogue, The Wire China, and Newsweek in the past. One of her recent pieces was 5 legal pitfalls to avoid if you use generative AI for your business. And finally, John Villaseñor is a professor of law, electrical engineering, and public policy at UCLA, where he founded and serves as co-director of the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, for everyone who's tuning in, you can submit your questions for the panelists at any time in the Zoom chat or using the Q&A feature. So we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So first, why don't we start by trying to get everyone pretty much on the same page? We hear a lot about AI, generative AI, AGI, and superintelligence. Those terms float around quite a bit. Let's start with Calum. I'm wondering if you could give us a quick breakdown of how you define and differentiate between those terms.
Good morning, everybody. The challenge obviously is going to do it quickly. So if I start blathering on too long, then feel free to shut me up. So we are witnessing today an explosion of GPTs. GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. The launch of GPT-3, Chat GPT in November, led to the fastest uptake of any app ever. But GPT-4, launched this March, was the real eye-opener. Its capabilities are amazing and a huge leap on what went before. And all of this is the result of the second big bang in AI. In 2017, some Google researchers published a paper called Attention is All You Need, and they introduced transformer AIs. So that's what's led to all of this remarkable development. These models, these AI models, are huge. They cost around $100 million to train. The Chat GPT had 175 billion parameters, and a parameter is analogous to the synapse in a human brain. OpenAI, the people behind Chat GPT and GPT-4, have not said how many parameters GPT-4 has, but Mark Zuckerberg recently estimated it at around 650 billion parameters. So these models are enormous. They are trained on pretty much the whole of the internet. And they're called generative because they generate text and images. They are being used by an awful lot of people around the world, but their deployment and adoption in the commercial world and in governments is quite slow because a couple of things. One is that they make big mistakes. They do something called hallucinating or confabulation. They invent stuff. I've had GPT-4 help me write a book on Rome. I was writing an illustrated book on Rome, and it just invents stories about Rome that never happened. So you have to check. what they produce before you can use it. The other worry is about data, about whether the data that you give them to work on will end up somewhere else in the hands of a competitor or perhaps even worse, a government. So these are the reasons why adoption isn't as fast as we might have expected, but it is still, they are being used by a lot of people. Rachel, you mentioned a lot of words connected with AI. It's worth trying to define some of them. Some people say artificial intelligence is the wrong phrase. Some people say AI is just hype. Neither of those things is true. Intelligence is easily described in just 4 words: goal-directed learning behavior. So an entity is intelligent if it learns as it pursues a goal and uses the learning to achieve the goal better. And artificial intelligence is simply an intelligence that was created by us or perhaps by aliens, but not by evolution or by God. And it's important to distinguish between intelligence and consciousness. They're not related. Well, they may be causally related, but they're not the same thing. It may well be that we will create an AI which is human level, human equivalent, and has no consciousness whatsoever, not even any sentience, which is the ability to have sense impressions. Consciousness adds self-reflection to that. We don't know whether consciousness is just an emergent product of big enough level of intelligence or whether it's something entirely different. We don't know how useful it is. It may just be a byproduct in us, or it may be essential to our existence. We just don't know. We also don't know to what extent the AIs that we're creating will have agency, and that could turn out to be very important later on. Just to give a bit more context, if I haven't exhausted your patience yet already, Rachel, I'm expecting you to wave at me if you get bored.
You are giving us a really good baseline. I want you to keep in mind that before we end for the journalists, I would love to have a real delineation between the 4 separate terms: AI, generative AI, superintelligence. So why don't you hold your fire there for a minute and we'll move on to the next question. And that is, both in the AI world and in the general public, it almost feels like this has happened at a lightning fast speed and we can't keep up. And so I'm wondering, Marie, could you walk us through why it's all of a sudden popping up and happening so quickly?
Yeah, happily. And Calum hit on a couple of key developments there, and I'll just add to that a bit. So often when we talk about developments in technology, as it relates to artificial intelligence or similar subjects, we think about, 2 different categories: the hardware side and the software side. Increasingly, those categories are blurring together in different ways. These things have to be developed together. They have to be developed in concert. But in very general terms, I think there's 3 things that everyone should sort of keep in mind here in terms of where we've been that's going to allow us to see where we're going. There is, on the hardware side, we have huge developments in AI-specific chips, processors, other sorts of hardware type, things that have been developed specifically for these types of uses around artificial intelligence. So that allows them to be much more powerful and much more efficient than previous generations of hardware that have been asked to do the same things. We also have on the software side advancements in algorithms, in neural networks, in various different language processing models that make it so that we, as lay people, as journalists, as lawyers, may be able to interact with these things in a less technical way. We can use the same sorts of language that we use every day to talk to our friends to interact with this technology. But the other thing that people often forget about is the role of big data and cloud computing here. These are the massive developments that have both allowed these models to be trained relatively quickly, have accelerated their advancement, and have also created this ability for people outside of the extremely technical and computer worlds to be able to not only interact with these things, but to create their own tools. Now, this explanation may be way too simple for some of you out there, and too technical for others. But what I will remind, especially the journalists on this webinar, is that one of our most sacred duties is to hold the powerful accountable, right? We know that artificial intelligence is an incredibly powerful tool, and I just mentioned some of the reasons why, it has become so powerful. The extent to which the community of journalists in this country and other countries are going to be able to hold it accountable is another question. And I think for all of the journalists, reporters out there, it's really important to have at least a basic understanding of what it is that's going on, so that everyone, not just the national and international reporters, but the local newsrooms, can make sure that they're keeping an eye on these developments.
That's an important point, and thank you so much for stressing that. We know that, as fascinating as it is at this moment, it's not perfect yet. And so, Jennifer, in your article, you wrote that legal issues of using AI, including copyright and trademark infringement, rights of publicity violations, and what Calum mentioned, hallucinations, they seem to be getting the most attention in media coverage. Can you explain just what some of those terms mean for us?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess, first of all, I am not a lawyer. So, but I have spoken to a lot of lawyers and a lot of people who are using these tools. And so I think they're kind of three buckets where you see a lot of risk. One would be when you're taking things out of an AI system, you're having them generate some kind of content. And in those cases, you want to make sure that, as you say, it's factually accurate, that you're not spreading any sort of harmful information, and also that you're not infringing on someone else's IP because you are using content that was scraped from the web and put into whatever you're planning to publish. And then there are also concerns that if you, say, ask a program like Midjourney to create an image of a celebrity or a famous character, and then you use that in your marketing materials, that could be a right to publicity or another copyright infringement issue. The second big bucket that we're looking at is what you put into these systems. And there you want to be careful that you're not putting your own IP in there, that you're not putting in, say, customer information, say you put in an account number or health information or things like that. It's a little bit theoretical now how information would be extracted, how someone could get something out that's been put in. But you certainly don't want to be that first person who has all the articles written about them, how they lost control of their company's IP. There's also an issue of if this information is subpoenaed, if it's health information or something like that, or someone talking about getting gender affirming care or abortions or things like that, you don't necessarily want that in systems where they could be extracted in the future. And then the third bucket would be when you're using AI for decision making. So a lot of people are creating custom content, or they are using AI to create chatbots and things like that. And you want to be really careful that you're not giving people false information, that you're not discriminating, you're not engaging in price discrimination, or that you're not, say, just pushing one thing to a certain protected group and not another, and things like that. And the FTC has been really clear in the past few months that they are looking out for this sort of thing, and that it's not an excuse that the AI did it, that you can't explain the decision. You're still responsible. Consumer protection laws still apply in the same way.
Jamie, how are you dealing with the issue or the risk of hallucinations? I mean, how is LexisNexis large language model different from that of a Chat GPT, for instance?
Yeah, so last month we announced a new generative AI product. It's called Lexis Plus AI, and so that lets lawyers ask legal questions. And Lexis Plus AI, it will commercially release it later this summer. There's a few different ways that we improve the model output. Now, Chat GPT right out of the box is pretty incredible. We've all tried it, and it gets a lot of buzz for a reason, but it's just not accurate enough for kind of real life legal use cases. So there's a few things that we do. So number one is we integrate the large language model with our leading content and enrichments, and that's done through our search engine. So that makes sure that the answer that you see in Lexis Plus AI, it's grounded by our content. And so this really helps to reduce hallucinations. It also ensures that up-to-date content is being considered, because right now the models are pre-trained, there's a cutoff date, and so there's there's new content that's generated every single day that's not included in the core model. So it's important to supplement it. It also enables citation so that when you see an answer, when the model provides an answer, that we have specific documents that are referenced in that answer. That's really useful for lawyers. Second, our legal experts and data scientists help to train the model to improve the output in the use cases I talked about earlier. And there are various ways to train the model to do that I'm happy to talk about if folks are interested. Also, there are various large language models out there. Chat GPT, GPT-4, et cetera, gets a lot of attention, but there are a number of them out there. And some of the models are actually better suited to different use cases. So for Lexis+ AI, we take a multi-model approach and select the best model for each use case. So all of this is done in a secure way. And so the models that we have are all private. None of the data within our model is used to train the model or kind of another model. And customer data is not used for model training at all. And they're all hosted in a secure cloud environment.
Well, now that we've been talking about LexisNexis, you recently surveyed 4,000 people and found that 59% of lawyers and 55% of law students said that they're currently using or would like to use AI tools for research. I'm turning to John here, and I'd like to ask you, how are you seeing students using generative AI already? And do you—
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was saying I think it's there's a bit of a panic among some corners of higher education, and I am not one of the people panicking. I think these are incredibly powerful tools, and that we should teach students to engage productively and responsibly with them, as opposed to telling students to trying, the sort of impossible task of forbidding their use. So, as an example, in my recently the law school class I was teaching at the UCLA School of Law, they had to write a paper, and I told them they're free to use AI tools, but that they are still solely and fully responsible for anything that they turn in bearing their name. So if it's plagiarized, they've committed plagiarism. If it's factually inaccurate or logically or stylistically inconsistent, that's on them. And I think that fits with a broader thematic point, is that as hard as it might be for everyone who's over about 25 or 20 to kind of realize the days when you start writing something with a blank sheet of paper are gone. And today's students who are going to be practicing their careers from now through the, say, 2070s to 2080s, depending on how young they are, they're going to live in a world where it's normal. It's just as normal for them to have access to AI tools as it is for us to have access to computers to help word processing, right, which at one time was novel. And so the best approach is to teach them to use these tools responsibly. The other thing I'll say is, people, it's sort of a parlor game to kind of point out the ways in which today's large language models are failing and insufficient, but just wait a year or 2 years or 5 years. And the capabilities are going to get incredibly, they're going to be incredible improvements. So I think I'm a full believer in helping students engage with the technology world they're going to inhabit, and not have that clouded by a bias in favor of the technology world that no longer exists, which was sort of the pre-widespread access to AI world that we all grew up in.
Well, we've heard from all of you now, and I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience and to hear more about that. But before we go to that, I want to return to Calum, and I'm going to ask you to tell this journalist and all the other journalists listening here, give us a quick thumbnail definition of the terms, a basic sort of quick top of mind definition for the term AI, generative AI, AGI, and superintelligence. Is it possible to sort of boil it down in that way?
Absolutely, it is. So AI, I defined earlier as artificially created entities which pursue goals and learn as they do so. And AI does that, and it's been doing it for decades. It's just been doing it an awful lot better since the Big Bang first AI Big Bang in 2012 when deep learning arrived, and the second AI Big Bang in 2017 when transformers arrived. So that's AI. Generative AI is the result of the second Big Bang in AI in 2017, the Google paper. And it's called generative AI because it generates text and images. So that's reasonably straightforward. AGI is an acronym stands for Artificial General Intelligence. People mean different things by it, but I think the simplest meaning for it is an AI which has all the cognitive abilities of an adult human. So you could call it human level AI. And once an AI gets to that point, it will rapidly become a superintelligence. AIs, machines, can be improved, and they can be improved very fast. They can be expanded, their architecture can be improved. Unfortunately, our brains can't be. We're limited to the 3.5 pounds of gloop inside our skulls. So these AGIs will rapidly become superintelligences and will become the smartest entities on the planet. We will become the second smartest entity on the planet. That's a position currently held by chimpanzees. And there's fewer than 500,000 of them. There's 8 billion of us. And the future of chimpanzees, both individually and collectively, is entirely determined by us. Chimpanzees have no say in the matter. Chimpanzees are quite lucky in one respect. They don't know about that. We will not be in that position. We almost certainly will know about it. So I think hopefully that covers AI, AGI, generative AI, and superintelligence.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to start with an interesting anonymous question. Someone wrote in and asked, I read in the press release that AI passed the uniform bar exam 90% of the time. But is that because it was fed the answers? Jamie, can you respond to that?
Yeah, it was actually trained on previous tests. So it wasn't fed the answers to that one specific test. But it was trained on kind of answers to previous tests. But it shows, with proper training that then you could really improve the output of LLMs in specific use cases.
We have a question here from a trial lawyer, William Ruskin. He says he's concerned about AI-generated fake photographs or other documents that someone may wrongfully seek to enter into evidence at trial as real. Is there any process that a trial lawyer may use to differentiate between the real and the AI generated? Who'd like to take that?
I can take a stab. I mean, I think that is a real concern now. And as we saw in New York, there was a lawyer who submitted a brief that included fake precedents, and it happened a week or two ago. So there are some efforts to have AI generated images include watermarks. And in some jurisdictions outside of the US, they're starting to require that. But, there really isn't a way to verify these things at this point. And that is a real concern that I think everyone should be looking at. You can do some things on your own, such as reverse image searching to see if the image pops up in Google and things like that. But I don't know that there's a foolproof method in place just now.
It's worth saying that at the moment, these deepfakes they're not quite perfect. They've got one particular habit of giving humans, too many fingers. For some reason, they think we've got 6 fingers. That will be removed as a problem. And in the medium term, what's going to happen is images are going to have a chain of custody. There's going to have to be, one way of doing this is that if you're a journalist or a lawyer for some reason taking pictures, you have a camera which is continually submitting images to a cloud, and there is an audit process that reviews this image and makes sure that it isn't tampered with until the point when it's used. So we're going to have to start having verification techniques like that. At the moment, you can just about tell a deepfake, but in the future, that won't be the case.
I'd like to ask Jennifer, how difficult would it be for journalists to keep up with the changes in AI so that their reporting fully captures the possibilities and the nuances?
Yeah, I think that what I'm seeing and hearing is that people are incorporating AI into their workflows in so many different ways. And sometimes even if a company doesn't know or isn't using from the top, one of their coders or programmers or writers may be doing a little bit of work with artificial intelligence with these generative AI programs that create text or code on the side. So I think, Marie touched on this earlier, but it is really going to be something that we all need to continue learning about and continue following and continue speaking to people about how they're using these products, because I think people are experimenting left and right with how they can use these products.
We've seen the explosion of fact-checking entities and arms from many of the major media companies. And so I'd like to ask Marie, what do you think journalists need to do to keep up with those? What classes will they have to take? What courses? How do you think that will look in the future?
Well, I think most of the reporters in any of the newsrooms that I worked with recently would shudder at the idea that they would have to take a class or read a book, and yet, I'm sure it would be helpful for any journalist at this point. I think, realistically understanding the existing limitations and challenges that journalists in this country and many other countries are under, both around time and compensation and everything else that's creating pressure on local newsrooms. Maybe just keeping a few key points in mind. I mentioned some of the technical things at play here. We've talked about how it's really important to remember that we can't assume that data that we feed into these things is private, that it could, be anywhere, and we have to be comfortable with that. And we can't necessarily assume that the things that we get out of an AI are correct. And those are two big things, privacy and accuracy. And so for, your average reporter, who's on deadline in a newsroom with limited resources, I like to think about things in terms of how can we use this in ways that are relatively low risk, but high reward, so for example, generating word counts really quickly, or trying to figure out, the column inch length of something if you're working with a paper product, or generating language for public records requests or grant applications. All of those are things that when you have if you have the time to sort of, have someone double check something to make sure it's accurate, or, for example, generating possible headline ideas. I think that's always something that's really fun and can be useful for many local newsrooms. So if you can just kind of you keep yourself in the loop enough to know kind of the major points going on right now, and do the things that you normally do around, taking a look at the headlines and trying to understand the most recent developments, I think most journalists will be able to understand enough with a little bit of extra research to be able to do their jobs with a little bit more information around this.
I'm going to pivot out of the newsroom and back into the courtroom here with this question from Steve Emmert of Sykes and Borden. He asks, I'd like to know if the coming version of generative AI can learn to write in a particular voice. He says he's a well-established appellate lawyer, and he's wondering whether an enterprising competitor could somehow feed a string of his briefs into the product and then ask it to generate an appellate brief of such and such case using Steve's writing style. That's an interesting question. Who wants to take that one on?
I mentioned earlier that I wrote a guidebook to Rome using GPT-4, and to do that, I fed GPT-4 6 of my previous books and told it to write in that style. And it had a reasonable go at it. It was very far from perfect. I'm not saying my writing style is perfect, but it was very far from a perfect replica of my writing style. But it was a start. And an important thing to remember, both Marie and John have referenced this, we are only at the beginning of our journey with AI. We're on an exponential growth curve. Our technology is improving at an exponential rate. And when you're on that kind of a growth curve, what happened yesterday is trivial compared to what's going to happen tomorrow. So they're going to get much, much, much better. You can see how they write in a different style very simply yourself, just by telling GPT 3.5 or 4 to write a thank you letter in the style of William Shakespeare. It has a reasonable go at it. So the answer to Steve's question is, yes, it could happen. Right now, it wouldn't be all that great, and it wouldn't really pass a sort of a sophisticated user's sniff test. But in the future, yeah, sure, it could be done.
And just to follow up, a common scenario that we see, Lexis Plus AI focuses on 3 sets of use cases. One is conversational search for complex legal research. The second one is document drafting, which I'll talk about in a second. So that's analyzing a document or creating a new draft of a document. And then the third is summarization. So summarizing either a long document or a set of documents or legal concepts. On the document drafting side, so as Calum mentioned, where the plan is to actually make it really easy for a lawyer to type in just a few simple prompts, and then you could generate a draft of a legal document. And then you could refine that document in a conversational way. You can ask it to make it more firm. For example, if it's a contract, we have a video on that. You could also, in language, you could change the voice. Now, one of the common requests that we get is a little bit a reverse of that of the question, which is, I have standards for tone and content in my firm. How do I draft a document with those standards? That's actually something super interesting to us that that we're working on right now. But it is possible right now for anyone to manually copy someone's tone. And so the idea for us is to make it easier to leverage someone's tone and style within a firm itself. That's our plan, as opposed to copying a competitor.
Well, since we're talking about these kinds of issues, I wonder if, John, why don't you tell us what you think the most important ethical concerns are when it comes to using AI in the legal field?
There's a number of them. First of all, again, my broader view on AI is, I think there's a huge number of benefits, but obviously, like a lot of technologies, there are concerns. So client confidentiality is one very important issue in terms of ensuring that there can be complex and very important rules about exactly who is allowed access to data and information relating to clients, and it's very important when using those systems to make sure that the use of such systems complies with whatever restrictions on confidentiality are in place. I guess certainly accuracy is another a really big concern. So those are some of the ones that come to mind, sort of top of mind. But I would also say more broadly that the concerns about sort of ethical use of AI technology are in many ways similar to the concerns about ethical use of lots of other kinds of digital information technologies like the internet that we've had for quite a long time. So I think we're well practiced, or should be well practiced, at thinking some about some of those things already. We just have to sort of graft them into the AI context.
We have a question from a journalist here. Andrea Lagobe says, why was AI created if it's bound to cause problems within our industries, in society, in employment, and even greater chaos? What are the benefits?
Can I answer that one? There's just an innumerable number of benefits, and you can ask the same question about, I don't know, why was the internet created? And of course, the internet has created a lot of problems, but I think most of us would agree that we wouldn't, turn the switch to turn the internet off if we could, because the benefits outweigh the problems. Last month, there was a scientific paper published that documented a new antibiotic that was discovered thanks to use of AI, that's an extraordinary discovery. And AI is going to revolutionize drug development. It's going to broaden access to education, to all kinds of services. I mean, you think about bringing the ability to produce good writing to everybody. Not only the people who have had the privilege of attending, many years of K through 12, and then afterwards, higher education. It's going to just create an enormous number of opportunities, and of course, there's going to be concerns as well. But I think the promise of AI, in lots of ways. I'll just give you another example. It's going to make it possible to do much better modeling for weather forecasting and climate change modeling, on and on and on. So there's an enormous number of benefits. It's not all bad. In fact, I think the good outweighs the bad. Having said that, of course, like any technology, it's got its downsides, and we have to be attentive to that and attentive to the potential misuses.
Well, since you've given us the sunny side up, let's ask Calum to really break down what we've been seeing in the news, or a thread of conversation, and that would be mitigating the risk of extinction from AI. Now, I know in newsrooms, we go for the man bites dog and the most dramatic elements of any story, but can you help us sort of understand the basics of what that thread means?
Sure. First of all, I want to say I agree with John. The potential benefits from AI are absolutely enormous. We've already had terrific benefits in terms of maps, which tell you how long it's going to take you to get from New York to LA, and they're right to within a few minutes, which is extraordinary. Face recognition has tremendous benefits, and and powerful search. We have something close to omniscience now, thanks to search plus Wikipedia. So it's given us tremendous benefits, and these benefits are only going to get bigger. But as John also said, like any powerful technology, it can have good and bad outcomes, and we need to try to guard against the worst outcomes. In the longer term, the two things that people really worry about with AI, one is that there will be no jobs for humans. And actually, I think this is going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen for a while. And I think it's going to happen quite suddenly when it does arrive. And until then, there's going to be lots of jobs for people. As long as there are things that humans can do that machines can't do, there'll be lots of jobs. However many individual jobs get automated, what automation does is it creates wealth, which creates demand, which creates jobs. But eventually, we'll get to the point where machines can do pretty much everything that we can do for money. And then there'll still be lots of new jobs, but the jobs will be done by machines. Now, a lot of people think that's going to be bad news. I think it's going to be very good news if we're a bit smart. A world in which machines do all the jobs could be a world in which the work that humans do, we don't get paid for it, but we do lots of work, and it's stuff we enjoy doing. We do it for fun. We learn, we socialize, we play. Beyond that, there is the really, really big risk of what happens when superintelligence arrives. And I'm afraid the news is not entirely good there, because we will lose control. When there is an entity on this planet 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times smarter than Albert Einstein, we're not going to be able to control it. There are a lot of smart people in the world, much, much smarter than me, who are working on the problem of how to make sure that superintelligence is safe. I just personally don't see how it can be done. How could a chimpanzee control humans? But like John, I'm an optimist. And I think that when we get a superintelligence on this planet, it will look at us and not think like the Terminator does in the movies, yuck, I don't like you, I'm going to get rid of you all. I think it'll look at us and say, you're 8 billion really quite interesting entities. And I'm not only going to keep you around, I'm going to help you thrive. And the things that it could do for us, if we know that our most powerful, our superpower is intelligence. It's what enables us to live a much more satisfying and fulfilling lives than any other animals on the planet. Well, if we have a superintelligence, it could solve all of our really big problems like war and poverty. And the really big one is death. There's every reason to believe that we don't need to die. It's just a biological piece of unfortunateness, bad design by Mother Nature that we die. And superintelligence could stop aging, and therefore death becomes optional. So I don't think we will entirely be able to control it. I think that our destinies will be somewhat out of our own hands, but I'm optimistic that the future is going to be extremely rosy.
Well, let's shift from those broad concerns to a sort of bottom line from an anonymous viewer who says or asks, are there any concerns in the legal community as to how AI will affect billing for work and profitability? This person says they can see where AI would eliminate many associate positions and remove the value of learning.
Yeah, maybe I could take that one. So we see with Lexis Plus AI, for example, we see it removing a lot of the drudge work that lawyers go through every day, and there's a lot of that, and it will help them to kind of elevate their work at a bit of a more high level. Now we've seen and kind of heard concerns about jobs with basically every new technical advancement. So if you think about even online legal research, the introduction of AI, analytics and decision tools, we've heard this at all stages. And when we've looked over time, the number of lawyers has actually all increased over time. Now, the nature of practicing law has changed over time, and it's evolved. And so I do think it is really important to keep up to date on these tools that exist and to be able to use AI to maximum benefit. But we see it kind of elevating the position of lawyer.
Marie, I really actually appreciated your advice to journalists and sort of giving me a sense of this is something that I can wrap my brain around. But I'm wondering if you can give some specific advice as to a course or something online that any journalist could access.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to see a lot more of that here in the near future. I mean, clearly, this is a topic that many people want to know about, want to learn about. And I think as more news outlets recognize that their public is interested in this and hungry for this information, we will hopefully see the corresponding increase in courses specifically geared towards journalists. I can tell you that a lot of the things out there, are, it's pretty minimal. However, the Center for Cooperative Media had an excellent workshop that I attended earlier this year. I would really recommend that everyone check out that and any other resources they have on artificial intelligence. But for me personally, and for many of the journalists I know, some of the most helpful thing has been interacting with these tools yourself, taking the time that you can to, play around with it. They're very accessible. They're pretty easy to use. And you can pretty quickly see some of the pitfalls with these things. And then you are learning at a time when you have a little more time to play around with it, as opposed to when you're on deadline, or when you need to cover some breaking news that has something to do with AI. And I don't know how much breaking news there has been about AI, but it is going to happen. And it will happen on the local level as well as the national level. So sometimes the best thing to do is to just, jump in there and get dirty. And you'll see, as you learn how to, manage your prompts and the other ways that you interact with the tools, what it is really good at and what the tools are not very good at. And that can inform your reporting.
I'm going to ask Jennifer to jump in there as well. Give us some sort of quick advice to help assure us journalists that we can handle this thing.
Yeah, well, I think as a journalist, you always have to learn new things and jump into covering new fields. Sometimes you get assigned a story and you have to get up to speed really quickly. So this is going to be one of those times when we all just need to kind of figure out the lay of the land and start talking to a lot of people. And I agree, just playing with these tools can sometimes be very, very valuable. One of the last stories I did at Wired, I created a bunch of fake resumes to see if I could get them past LinkedIn's filters. And you saw very quickly the way that it creates pretty good text, kind of repetitive, but I experienced an AI hallucination firsthand when it just made up a bunch of journal articles that this professor I made up had written. And so I think just by playing with them, figuring out how to write prompts, talking to people about what they're using, you'll get a sense. And a lot of people are very, very excited about it. I think that you're going to see AI coming into different workflows, different people's lives in small ways, left and right. So it is important to, play around with it, get to know what's happening.
We're seeing a lot of concerns in the chats about loss of jobs, loss of positions because of AI. And so I wanted to ask Calum for his thoughts. What are your thoughts about which positions in law firms, or maybe even newsrooms for that matter, are most expendable? Which might be the ones that are most affected?
I think what's much more likely to happen is that the nature of the work will change, and also that people who decline to work with AI, people who decline to follow Jennifer's advice and just get their hands dirty and play with it, they're going to lose out to people who do that. I think if you work with AI, you're going to be in a much better position than if you don't. And it's a bit of a cliche now, but I think it's true that a machine won't take your job, but a human plus a machine might well. People in the law field, I know, are very concerned about whether the billable hours model is going to be eradicated by these things, and whether new joiners to the industry can successfully become trained to be tomorrow's partners. I had lunch yesterday with a retired, very senior lawyer from an international firm who's set up actually an AI firm for lawyers. And he's quite convinced that neither of those two things will happen, that the billable hours model will continue, and people will be able to do more interesting billable work because the drudge work will be done by machines. And also that new trainees are going to be able to learn. They won't do the same amount of drafting that many people on this call have done and probably hated while they're doing it, because an AI will do the first round of the drafting. But they'll have to critique it continuously, and they'll have to know what they're doing in order to get it right, before it's presented to a client. So I think that certainly in the medium term, until machines get to the point where they can do pretty much everything we can do for money, and as I say, that will then be a phase change and we're into a different world then. But up until that point, I think basically what's going to happen is people who don't work with AIs will find they are going to lose their jobs, but everybody else is going to find that their work gets more interesting and a lot more efficient. One of the things I'm interested in is over the next year or two, we ought to see a huge jump in productivity in the economy as these relatively new tools, these generative AI tools, get deployed. We could see a doubling of productivity, which would have a remarkable impact on GDP.
I'm going to ask. Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if I can just add that I think the training is also going to go in the other direction. We're going to have the younger, earlier career people training the people who are farther into their careers. I mean, if you look at what happened in the, say, late 1990s in law firms, it was the new college and new law school graduates who understood how to use the emergent, internet, which was then getting widely accessible, and that they often were the ones sort of, explaining to the senior partners in law firms, what is this internet thing and how do you use it? And for the same way, I think that the more experienced lawyers are going to be looking to learn from the newer graduates about AI tools. So I think that's an important aspect of the dynamic as well.
For the journalists here, we've seen so many wrenching headlines lately about layoffs and downsizing at media companies. So I'd like to ask both of you quickly, how do you think this will reshape how newsrooms look in the future?
There'll be a lot more use of AI. I think the real reason why there are fewer journalists around is that the business model of newspapers has been eroded by the fact that the internet has destroyed classified advertising in newspapers, and indeed quite a lot of display advertising as well. So in short, Google and Facebook have stolen Rupert Murdoch's lunch, so Rupert Murdoch can't afford to employ so many journalists. I think it's really much more that than anything to do with AI. In the future, what will probably happen is there'll be a lot more writing. And a lot more good writing, and journalists will be helped in the same way that I described earlier for lawyers. I think the same is going to be true for journalists. Journalists will be able to do more. They'll be able to do more interesting work because AI will do the first draft.
Marie, in terms of newsroom settings and people that you know in the industry amongst your friends, what are you hearing talk about this issue?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not feeling as optimistic as Calum, although I agree, this isn't just about AI. This is about the financial pressures and business model issues that have been, around in this country for, decades, since the start of the internet, and the additional pressure that has created on outlets. And, as someone who has covered, business and economic development for quite some time, it's, this constant issue about innovation, right? To what extent does it allow people to do more interesting work, to create this loss of jobs? And the truth of the matter is that the people who are the lowest paid are the ones to suffer. They are often not given the opportunity to be trained up into more interesting work. So, I think it remains to be seen as to the extent to which AI and over what time period is going to impact journalism. But my concern, as always, is with the local outlets. I think that, when it comes to the better resourced outlets, the national outlets are the ones with strong funding. Yes, that's where we will see things quickly change for the better, hopefully. But with the smaller ones, the ones that are already struggling, it's going to be a real challenge, and it's going to be up to those communities and to the larger and more well-resourced funders to recognize the fact that this is going to impact things, and in turn impact democracy because of our role as the fourth estate. So there's some real concerns here, but also the opportunities for communities to step up and support their local news outlets.
Several attorneys in the chat are asking, they want Jamie to tell them, when will this become readily available? Will it be affordable for most law firms or individual lawyers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Lexis Plus AI, it's in commercial preview right now. So we're working with a small number of law firms just to iterate on the product to make it better, make sure it's ready for a commercial release. And commercial release will happen later this summer. And it's a little bit early to talk about commercials, but when we get closer to commercial release, so later this summer, so we'll talk more about that. By the way, if anybody is interested in keeping up to date with the work that's going on in Lexis Plus AI, so we have what's called an AI Insider program. So you can see that we have a Lexis Plus AI page, and you could join it from that. Anyone could join it, and we keep that group up to date with everything that's going on. And maybe we could publish a link in the follow-up mail here.
If I can just add, I think there's a burgeoning startup ecosystem. So it's not only the established players like LexisNexis, but what I assume must be hundreds of other companies around the country and around the world that are going to be creating products and tools that use AI to compete with and offer services in this area. So we're going to see in the next couple of years a real sort of mushrooming of opportunities. And some of these companies will succeed, some of them will fail, but at least some of those products are going to be really good and will increase the number of offerings available to business consumers, which is exactly how we want the system to work.
I am going to take moderator's privilege here as we wind down and ask each of you to respond to a brilliant question from David Pontoppidan. I hope I haven't ruined your last name there, but David writes, given the huge potential for monopolization in the technology space, there's a recipe for real nightmare inequality. Imagine being the 1% being able to afford immortality. So he goes on to say, how can journalists and lawyers, given their crucial role in upholding a just and free society, help ensure an equitable distribution and implementation of AI? So I'm going to ask Jamie to start.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I could focus maybe on the legal side. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to help improve the rule of law. So, our mission as a company is to help support and drive the rule of law around the world. And so there's a commercial offering that I talked a lot about with Lexis+ AI, but there's a lot of work internally also to see how can we actually use generative AI to help drive the rule of law in countries that don't have strong rule of law right now. So there's a number, you'll hear more about that over time as we announce it, but there's a lot of kind of internal work happening within LexisNexis on that.
Jennifer, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer to such a big question, but I do think one of the things a lot of people are looking at right now is, as it came up earlier in the conversation, these AI models are very expensive to develop, very expensive to train. You need a lot of cloud computing infrastructure. And so we're potentially going to have a situation where the big companies like Meta and Google are kind of the gatekeepers and are controlling everything. And so to the extent that we can encourage more experimentation, smaller companies to come up and look at ways that maybe we can democratize developing tools, I think that's one area where journalists can maybe shed some light into some of these issues and ways in which we can get more people into the field, more companies involved, more competition.
Calum, what are your thoughts about this?
A couple of thoughts. Firstly, the history of technology is one of improving living standards for everybody. The living standard of the poorest people, certainly the poorest people in the developed world and even in the undeveloped world, is vastly better than it was 300 years ago. And that's thanks mostly to technology, also to capitalism, but mostly to technology. We live like kings and queens did 300 or 400 years ago. And it is much, much more profitable to sell a technology relatively cheaply to everybody than to sell a diamond encrusted version of it just to celebrities and oligarchs. When the iPhone came out in 2008, it was phenomenally expensive and looked like a rich person's toy, and it didn't work very well. And now you get smartphones in the hands of everybody. Everybody in the developed world has one, and you go to a train station in Ghana or Kenya, everybody's got one in their hands. They're everywhere because of this simple fact that it is so much more profitable to sell something valuable to everybody rather than just a few people. And the same will be true of immortality, or at least the end of death, the end of aging. If and when that arrives, it will be available very quickly for everybody. As for what journalists can do to help uphold a just and free society, to be brutal, do their jobs properly. If you think a particular politician is a liar and you hate him and you can't wait to get rid of him, then don't go on television every night telling the audience that he's a great guy.
Jennifer, or Marie, excuse me. A great theme in the media industry now is access to information, and who's at the table, who's doing the reporting, and which communities are they focusing on. So in terms of AI in that equation, do you feel like it will lead to a democratization of information and access?
I mean, I think it's too early to tell, but it's really the crux of the issue here. And I'm so glad you're bringing this up and that David submitted their question. And I always go back to, those the sacred duties of journalists, holding the powerful accountable and bringing a voice to the voiceless. And whenever we're writing or talking about AI here or anything else for that matter, we really need to keep that in mind. And we need to make sure that we as newsrooms are holding ourselves as accountable as well to those things and understanding that the various experiences of our reporters and editors are also going to change the way we tell stories and the information is distributed to the public and which members of the public are going to be able to have access to those stories. So it's something that we all need to keep in mind. I have no doubt that we are mere months away from AI issuing its own press releases or holding press conferences if it's not doing that already. So everyone needs to be prepared to be asking the tough questions of themselves as well as other people and within their own newsrooms.
John, what are your thoughts before we start to wind up?
Just really quickly, a couple things. As as one of the other panelists mentioned, the history of technology is one that things that start out expensive become democratized and accessible. Another example is refrigeration. Right? There was a time when that was a luxury. And in some parts of the world, that's still not accessible. But in the United States, the vast majority of people have access to a refrigerator. Same thing with mobile phones. I remember in the early 90s, late 80s, there was criticisms that mobile phones were just a tool for the wealthiest, which was often a true statement. But of course, today, essentially everyone on the planet, every adult on the planet who wants to, has the ability to procure a mobile phone. So and if you look at things like Google search, Google search is accessible to everybody. Social media networks are accessible to everybody. So there's the access side, and then you can look at the provider side, where there is a lot of consolidation among a relatively small number of providers, and those dynamics are obviously worth watching. The one thing I'll say, though, is it's always important to keep in mind is that what we think of today, or what are today some of the giants in the space, were not always giants in the space, right? So Google was not the first entrant in the search space, right? There was a time when people were doing their searches on Yahoo and Google didn't exist yet. Facebook and now Meta was not the first entrant in the United States in social media. I remember a time when MySpace was a thing a lot of people were using. And so we should, based on that lesson, expect that the big companies in the tech space in 20 years are not necessarily going to be companies. Some of the companies we've heard of today will still be around, of course, but there will be new companies we haven't yet heard of that'll be big players as well. So it's a complicated ecosystem, but the difference between the providers and the users is an important difference to keep in mind.
I have a few more burning questions here, so I'm hoping that you can stick with us a little bit longer than the hour, panel. And one of them is, how can lawyers trust the answers that Lexis plus AI gives them? What is happening on the back end to make sure that they're accurate?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we're doing to improve the model output. So one is called fine tuning, where our legal experts help to train the model to answer questions better in specific use cases. That's one. The second one is called prompt engineering, which the customer lawyer will type in a question, but then we supplement it with a lot of other information behind the scenes that the lawyer doesn't even see. But all this helps to guide the output. The third one is the one that's probably most useful. So this is search integration. So this is where we integrate the model with our content so that the answer that's shown there, that's all grounded by our content. So it cycles between the model and the content. So it uses the power of the technology of the large language model with our content to produce an answer that's based on our content. And then underneath the answer, you'll get specific citations. So these are the documents that help to generate the answer. And you could click on the documents just like you would normally to see, and incorporates a lot of our enrichments. All our proprietary work is kind of included in that as well.
And some other lawyers are asking how to use Chat GPT or other generative AI without risking a client's privacy. John, do you want to speak to that?
Well, as I said before, I would definitely not be putting any client confidential information into an internet service where unless you have a very clear assurance about how that data is being used. And so I certainly wouldn't do it. And so now that said, I think there are or will soon be products that are offered that do probably provide some level or some kind of guarantee of privacy, but I certainly would not paste anything confidential into into an internet engine where I don't have any control or understanding of exactly how that's being used. So I would be extremely conservative in that respect.
Just a quick follow. Yeah, sorry, a quick follow up on that one. So for us, so we built it. It's a concern that we hear all the time, and that we have also with all the products we build. So as we started building, we have privacy by design right from the beginning in the product itself. And so when I talk about customizing a model, training it for legal purposes, that's all done in private models. So all of the work that's done is kind of private to us, and then it's shared on a cloud platform where the data is contractually protected. And so this is Microsoft Azure and Amazon AWS. And also any prompt, any question that a customer types in, none of that bleeds, none of that is used for training. The answers and the questions, they don't bleed into another customer's questions or answers. So we make sure it's all segregated. So this is all done very specifically to make sure that the customer data and all our content is protected.
Can I just say one really quick thing, that just because a service says they provide privacy doesn't necessarily mean that's enough. I'll give you an example. There are protective orders in many legal matters that have very stringent requirements, place very stringent requirements on exactly where the data can be used. And so it's not enough. You have to be attentive to the terms of the protective order, in addition, of course, to scrutinizing the privacy policies of any service you're using.
Well, the final question for today is probably the hardest one. So there are many questions about whether and how AI will be regulated. So who'd like to take a stab at that one?
I think that you're hearing from various parts of the Biden administration that, to the extent that it's possible, existing laws are still going to apply, and people shouldn't assume that like AI is so new that things like consumer protection and copyright law don't apply. And so I think we're hearing a lot more from that. And I mean, you can look at what the EU has done as far as requiring people to be notified when AI is being used. China is also doing some similar things. So maybe in the US we'll be looking to some of that, but from what I'm hearing, there's also going to be a lot more happening at the local and state level with regulations around facial recognition or notification about hiring algorithms and things like that. So, I mean, my guess is there will be a patchwork across the US, including some reinterpretations of existing laws.
Any other thoughts about that, Calum? Do you have any?
Yeah, I suspect the world is going to coalesce around an agreed approach to regulation of AI. I mean, it's a very controversial, difficult subject. On the one hand, can regulators ever be expert enough to follow really closely what Google and Meta and the others are doing? Eric Schmidt, ex-chairman of Google, said they can't, and therefore they should let the industry self-regulate. I think most people are going to find that completely unacceptable. What the EU is doing is quite interesting. And the EU, very sadly, I live in Europe, and very sadly, the EU collectively seems to sort of decided it won't develop AI, but it'll regulate it. I'm not sure that's a great strategy. But the approach to regulation that they've taken in the AI Act, which is being voted on today in the Parliament, is actually reasonably smart. It's a risk-based approach, and it says you can deploy a model, but you better prove that you took due care and did all the things that a sensible organization would do to make sure you're not causing any harms. And we're not going to define what those steps are in advance. We're not also going to define what the harms are. But if you cause harms, we will sue you. And that's a bit of a tough rule, but it's actually pretty reasonable rule if you don't know in advance what sort of harms are going to be caused. So companies are on the metal. They know they have to behave responsibly. And that's the outcome we want.
And on that note, unless there are any other comments that our speakers want to add, I'd like to just say this has been a fascinating conversation. And I'd like to extend our thanks to all of our panelists today and to all of the participants for your great questions. And of course, to our sponsor, RELX and LexisNexis. Journalists, if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask and contact one of our speakers, please feel free to contact our program manager, Alyssa Black, at ablack@nationalpress.org. The National Press Foundation's mission to make good journalists better is through our free trainings, and you can learn all about them on our website at nationalpress.org. And please feel free while you're there to sign up for our newsletter. And we hope you'll come back and join us for our next webinar. Thank you all very much.